In the heart of New York City, Richard Carter, a prominent real estate mogul, celebrates his 60th birthday in a luxurious penthouse. Among the distinguished guests are his son, Elliot Carter, 32, and his daughter, Claire Carter, 29. The event highlights the stark contrast between Richard's successful career and the troubled dynamics within his family. Elliot, whose life over the past few years has been characterized by excessive partying and gambling, has accumulated significant debts. Despite his reckless lifestyle, he still seeks his father's approval, but his actions only widen the rift between them. Claire, a corporate lawyer at a prestigious law firm, is keenly aware of the growing tension in the family, particularly concerning her brother. As the night progresses, the atmosphere is filled with a mix of celebration and underlying strain. Richard's colleagues and friends praise his accomplishments, sharing anecdotes about his business acumen and generosity. Richard, a tall, commanding figure with graying hair and sharp blue eyes, graciously accepts their compliments, his gaze occasionally drifting to Elliot. Elliot, dressed in an expensive but slightly disheveled suit, moves through the crowd with a forced smile. He frequently checks his phone, responding to messages from dubious contacts. His eyes reveal the weight of his financial troubles, and he avoids direct conversation with his father, knowing it will likely lead to another argument. Claire, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, mingles effortlessly with the guests, her demeanor professional yet approachable. She occasionally glances at Elliot, her concern for him evident. Claire has always been the responsible one, the one who followed in her father's footsteps, albeit in law rather than real estate. Her dedication to her career has earned her Richard's respect and pride, but she is acutely aware of the growing distance between her father and brother. As the evening winds down, Richard gathers the guests for a speech. He stands at the head of the room, raising a glass of champagne. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate this milestone with me. I am grateful for your friendship and support over the years. I am proud of the success we have achieved together, and I look forward to many more years of prosperity." The guests cheer and toast, but the celebration feels hollow to Elliot. He steps outside onto the balcony, needing a moment to himself. The cool night air does little to calm his racing thoughts. He is acutely aware of the looks of pity and judgment from those who know about his troubles. Despite his best efforts, he has not been able to escape the shadow of his father's success. Inside, Claire approaches Richard, her expression serious. "Dad, I'm worried about Elliot," she says quietly. Richard's face hardens, the jovial mood dissipating. "He needs to get his act together," Richard replies curtly. "I've given him every opportunity, but he keeps making the wrong choices. I can't keep bailing him out." Claire sighs. "I know, but he's still family. We need to find a way to help him." Richard's expression softens slightly. "I know you're right, Claire, but he needs to show some responsibility. I can't just hand him everything on a silver platter." The conversation is interrupted as the guests begin to depart, thanking Richard for the evening. Claire and Richard exchange a look, both aware that the issue of Elliot will not be easily resolved. As the last guests leave, Elliot returns inside, his face set with determination. He approaches his father. "Dad, can we talk?" he asks, his voice tense. Richard nods, leading Elliot to his study. He closes the door behind them, signaling that this conversation is private. Elliot takes a deep breath. "I know I've messed up, but I'm trying to fix things. I need your help." Richard's eyes narrow. "Elliot, I've helped you more times than I can count. You need to take responsibility for your actions. You're not a child anymore." "I know, but this time it's different," Elliot pleads. "I'm in real trouble. If I don't pay off these debts, things could get dangerous." Richard's expression remains stern. "I can't keep throwing money at your problems. You need to figure out a way to handle this yourself." Elliot's face falls. "I understand. I'll find a way." Richard watches his son leave, a mixture of disappointment and concern in his eyes. As Elliot exits the study, he runs into Claire. She gives him a sympathetic look. "Elliot, please let me help you." Elliot shakes his head. "I need to do this on my own." Elliot Carter's life spirals further into chaos as he attempts to cope with his mounting debts and personal failures. Night after night, Elliot finds himself in New York's most notorious clubs, surrounded by dubious characters and fueled by alcohol. His once promising future now seems distant, replaced by a desperate bid to win big in high-stakes poker games, hoping to erase his financial troubles in one lucky night. Elliot's nights blend into one another, a haze of flashing lights, loud music, and the ever-present aroma of expensive cologne and sweat. The clubs are filled with people who thrive on excess, and Elliot has become one of them. He knows the names of all the bartenders and bouncers, and they know him as a regular, always chasing the next thrill. His gambling partners, a mix of seasoned hustlers and naive newcomers, are aware of his situation, often using it to their advantage. Elliot's desperation makes him an easy target, and he loses more often than he wins. One night, after a particularly brutal loss, Elliot meets Vincent, a slick-talking figure with connections to the criminal underworld. Vincent sees potential in Elliot, not as a partner, but as a pawn. He offers Elliot a deal, a substantial loan to cover his debts, with the condition that Elliot must repay it with hefty interest. Desperate and out of options, Elliot agrees, knowing deep down that this decision will only drag him further into the abyss. Meanwhile, Claire Carter's life stands in stark contrast to her brother's. She immerses herself in her work at a prestigious law firm, specializing in corporate fraud cases. Claire's days are filled with client meetings, court appearances, and meticulous case preparations. Her sharp mind and unwavering dedication have earned her a reputation as one of the firm's rising stars. Yet, despite her professional success, Claire's personal life is marked by a persistent worry for Elliot. Claire's current case involves a high-profile corporate fraud investigation. The stakes are enormous, with millions of dollars on the line and significant public interest. Claire's meticulous nature and attention to detail serve her well, but the pressure is immense. Long hours at the office and late-night strategy sessions are the norm, leaving little time for anything else. Despite her busy schedule, Claire makes an effort to maintain a connection with her father, Richard. Their conversations are often brief, squeezed in between meetings and court dates, but they are meaningful. Richard values Claire's insight and appreciates her efforts to keep the family together. Their relationship, while not without its challenges, is built on mutual respect and understanding. One evening, after a long day at the office, Claire decides to visit her father. "How's the case going?" Richard asks, his voice tinged with genuine interest. "It's progressing well," Claire replies, taking a sip of her drink. "But it's exhausting. There's so much at stake, and I can't afford any mistakes." Richard nods. "I'm proud of you, Claire. You've always been focused and determined. I know you'll see it through." Claire smiles, grateful for her father's confidence in her. However, her thoughts quickly turn to Elliot. "I'm worried about Elliot," she admits. "He's in deep trouble, Dad. I don't know how to help him." Richard's expression hardens. "He needs to take responsibility for his actions. I've given him every opportunity, but he keeps throwing them away." "I know," Claire says softly. "But he's still family. We can't just abandon him." Richard sighs. "I'm not abandoning him. But he needs to want to change. Until then, there's only so much we can do." As Claire leaves her father's house, her mind is heavy with concern for Elliot. Elliot's descent continues unabated. His nights are increasingly filled with reckless decisions and mounting debts. The loan from Vincent temporarily alleviates his immediate financial pressures, but the looming repayment deadline adds to his growing sense of dread. Elliot's paranoia intensifies. He constantly looks over his shoulder, fearing retribution from those he owes money to. Claire, despite her best efforts, finds it difficult to break through Elliot's defenses. Her rare attempts to reach out to him are met with hostility or indifference. The once close siblings are now estranged, their paths diverging further with each passing day. As the months go by, the tension within the Carter family reaches a breaking point. Richard's patience wears thin, and Claire's anxiety for her brother's safety grows. Richard has called for this dinner with a clear purpose. He believes that by formally announcing his decision regarding the inheritance, he can instigate a positive change in Elliot, who has been floundering under the weight of his debts and irresponsible lifestyle. Claire, dedicated and successful, sits across from her father, sensing the gravity of the evening but unaware of the specifics of what's to come. As the dinner progresses, the atmosphere is heavy with unspoken words. Richard clears his throat, drawing the attention of his children. He looks at Claire and Elliot, taking a deep breath before speaking. "I've given this a lot of thought," Richard begins, his voice steady but firm. "It's time to discuss the future of our family's estate and business. Given the current circumstances, I've made a decision." Elliot shifts uncomfortably in his seat, his unease palpable. Claire watches her father intently, her lawyer's mind already preparing for whatever announcement might come. Richard continues, "Claire, you've proven yourself to be responsible, dedicated, and capable. Therefore, I've decided that the bulk of my estate, including the business, will be entrusted to you." The room falls silent. Elliot's face turns red, a mix of shock and fury. He slams his fist on the table, making the dishes clatter. "What about me?" Elliot demands, his voice shaking with anger. "I'm your son too. How can you just write me off like this?" Richard remains calm but resolute. "Elliot, you've had numerous opportunities to demonstrate responsibility, but your actions have consistently shown otherwise. This decision isn't about punishment. It's about ensuring the stability and future of our family's legacy." Elliot's anger boils over. This is just another way to control me, to show that Claire is the golden child while I'm nothing but a disappointment. Richard sighs, the pain of the situation evident in his eyes. "Elliot, this isn't about favoritism. It's about what's best for the family. You can still turn things around, but you need to take responsibility for your life." Elliot storms out of the dining room, his chair toppling over. Claire looks from her father to her brother's retreating figure, feeling a deep sense of sorrow and helplessness. In the following days, Elliot begins to distance himself from the family. His anger and sense of betrayal drive him further into his reckless habits. Nights are spent in clubs, gambling and drinking, while days blur into a haze of frustration and despair. The more he tries to escape his reality, the deeper he falls into his self-destructive behaviors. Claire, determined to bridge the growing chasm between her and Elliot, tries to reach out to him. She visits his apartment, hoping to talk things through and offer her support. The apartment, once a stylish bachelor pad, now bears the signs of Elliot's neglect and turmoil. "Elliot, we need to talk," Claire says gently, standing at his door. Elliot barely looks at her, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep and excessive drinking. "What do you want, Claire? Come to gloat about how you've won everything?" Claire's heart aches at his words. "I'm not here to gloat. I'm here because I'm worried about you. We're family, and I want to help." Elliot scoffs, turning away. "Help? You can't help me. No one can. Dad's made it clear what he thinks of me." "Elliot, this doesn't have to define you," Claire insists. "You can still change things. I believe in you." But Elliot's resentment runs too deep. "You don't understand, Claire. You've always had it all together. You don't know what it's like to be the failure, the one everyone's ashamed of." Claire reaches out to him, but Elliot pulls away, his walls firmly in place. "Just leave me alone, Claire. There's nothing you can do." Defeated, Claire leaves, her heart heavy with the weight of her brother's pain. She returns to her work, throwing herself even more into her cases as a way to cope with the helplessness she feels. The strain in the family is now more pronounced than ever, with Richard and Claire both grappling with their own feelings of guilt and frustration. Vincent, seeing an opportunity, tightens his grip on Elliot, offering temporary solutions with strings attached, knowing that Elliot is too desperate to refuse. Nights spent in a drunken haze have become the norm, and it is during one of these nights that Elliot stumbles upon a message on a dark web forum. The message, posted by someone using the alias Spectre, offers a chilling solution to personal problems. The forum is filled with illicit services, but this post stands out to Elliot in his intoxicated state. Spectre claims to be a professional hitman, capable of solving any problem for the right price. The idea horrifies and intrigues Elliot simultaneously. For days, the thought gnaws at him. In his sober moments, Elliot is repulsed by the idea. but his desperation and anger keep pulling him back. One evening, after losing a significant amount of money in a poker game, Elliot's resolve weakens. Consumed by thoughts of revenge and feeling cornered by his mounting debts, he decides to take action. He transfers $10,000 of his remaining savings into the wallet. The money intended to buy himself a lifeline now earmarked for something far darker. His hands tremble as he sends a message to Spectre, providing detailed information about his father's routine, his office location, and his security details. Every time he logs onto the forum, his heart races. He checks for replies from Spectre incessantly, his anxiety growing with each passing hour. But after the initial confirmation of payment, Spectre disappears. No further messages, no updates, nothing. The silence is deafening, and Elliot's mind races with possibilities. Has he been scammed? Elliot's nights are plagued by nightmares. He dreams of his father's lifeless body, of blood-stained hands, and the look of betrayal in Richard's eyes. He wakes up in a cold sweat, the sheets tangled around him, the taste of regret bitter in his mouth. The guilt begins to consume him, gnawing at his sanity. He tries to drown it out with more alcohol, but the temporary relief it provides is fleeting. The paranoia begins to take a physical toll on Elliot. He loses weight, his face becomes gaunt, and dark circles form under his eyes. He starts avoiding people, retreating further into his apartment. Even his gambling and clubbing habits diminish, replaced by hours spent staring blankly at his computer screen, waiting for a sign from Spectre. One particularly dark night, as a storm rages outside, Elliot's phone buzzes. It's a message from an unknown number, containing only a single word: soon. The cryptic message sends a shiver down his spine. It feels like a death sentence, a reminder that he has set events in motion that he can no longer control. Elliot's paranoia reaches a breaking point. He starts seeing shadows where there are none, jumps at the slightest sound, and becomes convinced that everyone around him knows about his dark secret. His attempts to reach Spectre are met with silence, and the lack of control over the situation drives him to the edge of madness. The guilt and fear become too much for Elliot to bear. He decides to try and warn his father, hoping to undo the irreversible. He calls Richard's office repeatedly, but the calls go unanswered, each failed attempt amplifying his dread. Desperate, he sends emails, but they too go ignored. His last resort is to visit the office in person, but by then, it might already be too late. The day had arrived, a day that Elliot Carter had both anticipated and dreaded. Richard was engrossed in preparing for a critical presentation that could determine the future of his latest real estate project. He reviewed his notes, adjusting his tie and practicing his delivery in front of a mirror. The stakes were high, and Richard was determined to impress potential investors. Meanwhile, Elliot's mind was racing. The weight of his decision loomed heavily over him as he paced his dimly lit apartment. His phone, now his only connection to the hitman, had been silent for far too long. Elliot's gut told him that something terrible was about to unfold, but he had no way to confirm his fears. In a fit of panic, he dialed his father's number, desperately hoping to warn him about the impending danger. "Please pick up, please," Elliot muttered under his breath, his heart pounding. But as he heard the call connect, the line crackled, and Richard's voice remained elusive. "Come on, Dad, answer." The connection faltered, leaving Elliot frustrated and filled with dread. The reality of his actions began to sink in, but it was too late. He had already crossed a line from which there would be no return. Meanwhile, Claire Carter was experiencing her own turmoil. Having sensed something was off with Elliot for weeks, she had grown increasingly concerned about her brother's erratic behavior. After their last conversation, Claire decided to confront Richard about Elliot's issues, believing that they needed to address the situation as a family. She grabbed her purse and headed out of her apartment, determined to talk to her father. Dad needs to know how serious this is, she thought, racing through the busy streets of Manhattan. The closer she got to the office, the more anxious she felt. Something was wrong, and she could feel it in her bones. Claire pushed through the revolving doors of the building, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she approached the reception desk. "Good morning, Ms. Carter. Is everything all right?" the receptionist asked, noticing the worry etched across her face. "I need to see my father. It's urgent," Claire replied, her voice steady but her heart racing. She was led through the security check and toward Richard's office. As Claire approached the door, the building was filled with a palpable tension. Unbeknownst to her, Elliot's message had fallen into the wrong hands. The hitman, using Elliot's provided details, had infiltrated the building disguised as a courier. Dressed in a nondescript uniform and carrying a large box, he approached Richard's office, confidence masking his deadly intent. Just as the hitman was about to make his move, Claire pushed the door open. The hitman's eyes widened momentarily in surprise, but he quickly regained his composure. In the chaos that ensued, the door swung open fully, and Claire stepped inside, oblivious to the danger. "Dad!" she exclaimed, but her voice was cut short by the sight of the hitman. The tension in the room escalated instantly as Claire realized what was about to happen. Richard turned to see his daughter entering, and panic flashed across his face. "Claire, get out!" he shouted, but it was too late. The hitman, momentarily caught off guard, took aim at Richard, but Claire intervened. In the ensuing struggle, chaos erupted. Security personnel rushed in, alerted by the commotion. Shots rang out, echoing through the halls as the hitman attempted to flee. In the confusion, a bullet meant for Richard struck Claire in the abdomen, sending her crashing to the floor. "Claire!" Richard's voice filled the room, a mixture of horror and disbelief. He rushed to his daughter, kneeling beside her as blood pooled around her. The office was a scene of chaos, alarms blaring, and shouts of confusion filling the air. Elliot, still reeling from his failed attempt to warn his father, received a phone call just as he stepped outside. The ringing was jarring against the silence of his apartment. He answered quickly, his heart racing. "Elliot, it's an emergency. You need to come to the office right now." The voice on the other end was frantic. "Your sister has been shot." He raced out the door, the weight of dread crashing down upon him. As he made his way through the streets of Manhattan, each passing moment felt like an eternity. The realization of the consequences of his actions hit him like a wave. The very act he had considered was now responsible for the horror unfolding. When Elliot finally arrived at the office, the scene was chaotic. Police and paramedics flooded the building, and Elliot's eyes widened in shock as he spotted Richard kneeling next to Claire, his hands stained with her blood. The sight shattered any lingering hope Elliot had of reversing the damage. "Claire!" Elliot cried, falling to his knees beside them, tears streaming down his face. As investigators combed through the office for clues, surveillance footage revealed crucial details about the day of the shooting. The cameras captured the moment when the hitman entered the building, and their investigation quickly traced back to Elliot Carter. The records showed Elliot's erratic behavior leading up to the incident, and investigators pieced together the relationship between Elliot and the assailant, Spectre. Detective Lisa Hargrove led the investigation. She was a seasoned officer, with a reputation for thoroughness and an eye for detail. As she examined the footage, she noted Elliot's anxious demeanor and his frequent visits to the dark web in the weeks leading up to Claire's shooting. The connections were undeniable. They traced the money transfers, linking Elliot's anonymous cryptocurrency wallet to the payment made to the hitman. With this evidence, it became clear that Elliot was not only involved, but was the orchestrator of this horrific event. Confronted with the overwhelming evidence, Elliot found himself trapped in a web of grief and guilt. The weight of Claire's blood on his hands consumed him as he waited in the police station for his questioning. When the detectives entered the room, Elliot barely looked up. His face was pale, eyes sunken, haunted by the nightmares of his choices. "Elliot Carter," Detective Hargrove began, her tone serious. "We need to talk about what happened at your father's office." "I know," Elliot whispered, his voice barely audible. "I did it." His confession came unprompted, the words spilling out as if they had been trapped inside him, begging for release. The detectives exchanged glances, surprised by the admission but not wholly unprepared for it. "What do you mean you did it?" Hargrove pressed. "I mean, I hired someone. I thought it would solve my problems," Elliot said, his voice cracking. "But I never wanted this. I never wanted her to get hurt." The weight of his confession hung heavy in the air. Elliot's head dropped, tears streaming down his face as he realized the full extent of his actions. He had not only betrayed his sister, but had taken her life, and the repercussions of that night would forever change him. He was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, among other offenses. Elliot entered the courtroom, his demeanor subdued. He had made the decision to forego any defense, believing that he deserved the consequences of his actions. As the proceedings began, his attorney attempted to present mitigating factors. Elliot's struggles with gambling addiction, the pressure he felt from his father, and his tumultuous relationship with Claire. But Elliot remained silent, refusing to speak out in his own defense. When it was Richard's turn to testify, he rose from his seat, his face etched with grief. "Your Honor," he began, his voice shaking, "I stand here today not just as a father who has lost a daughter, but as a man who has failed to raise his son. I was so focused on my career, my business, that I didn't see the signs, didn't see how my son was suffering. I blame myself for what happened." Richard's words echoed through the courtroom, resonating with those present. He spoke of the love he had for his children, the sacrifices he had made for their well-being, and the regret that now filled his heart. He implored the court to consider the circumstances surrounding Elliot's actions, asking for leniency despite the gravity of the crime. "I lost Claire that day, and I don't want to lose Elliot too," Richard continued, his voice breaking. "He made a terrible mistake, but he is still my son." The emotional testimony weighed heavily on the judge and jury. While they could not overlook the severity of Elliot's actions, Richard's heartfelt plea reminded everyone of the complexities of family dynamics and the impact of mental health on decision-making. As the trial concluded, the jury deliberated for hours, weighing the evidence and the testimonies. The courtroom was silent as the jury returned, the foreman standing to deliver their verdict. "We find the defendant, Elliot Carter, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder." The verdict echoed through the courtroom, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Elliot's face fell, the realization of his fate crashing over him. He had expected this outcome, but the finality of it was crushing. He glanced at his father, who looked back with a mixture of sorrow and love, a complex blend of emotions swirling between them. As the judge pronounced the sentence, Elliot's heart sank deeper. He was to serve a 35-year sentence in a Kentucky state prison. The pain of losing Claire and the burden of his actions would follow him into the darkness of his confinement. Richard left the courtroom, the weight of his family's tragedy heavy on his shoulders. He would continue to grieve Claire, but he also understood the importance of addressing the issues that led to Elliot's actions. Richard committed himself to advocating for mental health awareness, hoping that by shining a light on the struggles families face, he could help prevent future tragedies.